What's going on, GOAT Format Duelists? ACP here, back with another GOAT Format video. Got some good tips for you today. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about the top 8 GOAT Format deck building mistakes that knowledgeable players are still making in 2021. So these are not brain farts like, whoops, I forgot to add Pot of Greed to my deck. These are strategic errors that I commonly see in both the main deck or side deck for various competitive decks right now. So chances are you might be making some of these mistakes yourself. If you are, no need to get offended or anything. Be sure to just try some of these tips, see how they work out for you. And if not, you can always feel free to attack me in the comments, as some people tend to do. So let's jump right into it, guys. Number 8, we've got not playing Blowback Dragon and Reasoning Gate decks. Now, quick aside here, for all of these tips, I'm not saying that these are mistakes 100% of the time. I'm just saying that they are usually mistakes in the most commonly played builds of the decks that I'm going to talk about. So let me explain why I think in the standard build of Reasoning Gate you should play Blowback Dragon. I kind of think of Blowback Dragon as almost being like a Dark Sacred Crane, in the sense that it has a very good effect that you can get whenever it's summoned. And of course, with Sacred Crane, we all know this is useful because, we can special summon Sacred Crane off Reasoning Gate, draw a card, banish it, bring it back with Dimension Fusion, draw another card, and so on. And with Blowback Dragon, you can kind of do the same thing. When I play Reasoning Gate, there are some times where I might activate Blowback Dragon as many as 3 times in one turn. And a key thing about Blowback that some people do forget is that when you activate its effect on a set spell or trap, they have to decide whether or not they're going to activate it before you flip the coins. So, for example, if your opponent has a set Scapegoat, you can use Blowback, target the set goats, basically force them to use it right away, and then, of course, if you have something like Lightning Vortex, you can clear the goats and hopefully attack for game. So overall, I think Blowback Dragon is one of the best Dark monsters in the deck. Obviously not as good as Dark Magician of Chaos, but I almost think that it's as good as Jinzo, which is a monster that pretty much all Reasoning Gate decks play. So if you happen to be wondering, what does my monster lineup look like in sort of a standard Reasoning Gate deck, it looks like the one shown here. That's 2 Cranes, an Air Knight, Blowback, Jinzo, and Dark Magician of Chaos. And the reason why I like this lineup is it keeps our Reasoning Gate targets pretty low, just 6, which means that we'll mill more cards off of our Reasoning and Monster Gate, which is what we want. It's half lights, half darks, and we don't really give our opponent amazing value on what level they can potentially call. So from my experience, people do like to call level 4 and level 8 quite a bit, and sometimes will even call level 5, but it's pretty rare that an opponent will call level 6 on Reasoning unless they have a bunch of traps set and they're really scared of Jinzo. Another point of confusion that I want to bring up is that I think there's this implicit assumption by most players that Air Knight Parshath is a better tribute monster in a Reasoning Gate deck than something like Blowback Dragon. And not only do I not think this is true, I actually think this is very, very wrong. Air Knight Parshath is, I would say, almost borderline bad in Reasoning Gate, and the reason why is because although it does draw a card which is good, you have to wait until your battle phase to draw the card, meaning that it won't actually help you kill your opponent. Some people do try to play Reasoning Gate deck as sort of a card advantage based deck, but fundamentally that's not what the deck is good at. The deck is good at killing your opponent all in one turn, or maybe sometimes 2 turns, but the fact is that Air Knight Parshath doesn't advance that win condition, whereas a card like Blowback Dragon definitely does. So give Blowback Dragon a shot in Reasoning Gate. I think you will be pleased with how it performs. Now for number 7, we've got playing Mystic Tomato and Dark Mimic LV1 without any copies of Dark Mimic LV3. Now, the reason why this is only number 7 on my list is because this isn't a mistake that I see a ton, but when I do see it, it's a pretty big mistake. And as someone who helped popularize this strategy, hopefully I can help explain why. The obvious combo is that, if Mystic Tomato is destroyed by battle, you can special summon Mimic LV1 in your standby phase, level up to level 3, and this thins your deck by 2 cards, and then if your opponent has a monster in play, which they probably do, you can crash your Mimic LV3 into their guy and draw 2 cards, which is pretty strong, although not necessarily something that comes up a lot. But the main reason that I like to play Mimic LV1 and Mimic LV3 in the same deck, especially in a Chaos deck, and I have talked about this before on my previous videos, but I think sometimes people forget, is that Mind Control is one of the most commonly sided cards against your typical Thunder Dragon Chaos deck. So what's so great about playing Mimic LV1 and Mimic LV3 together is that if your opponent mind controls your set Mimic LV1, sure, they can draw a card and pass it back, but then during your turn, you can just level it up, get level 3, and then, of course, if the level 3 dies, you draw 2 cards. So it turns their mind control into a very risky proposition. And, of course, if you're playing Mimic LV3, sometimes your Mystic Tomato will get destroyed by battle, you've already searched your Sangan, and maybe your opponent has another attack. So in this case, you're going to want to get Mimic LV3 so that you can still draw a card. Now, these Mimic strategies in general haven't been super popular as of late, and normally when I see them played, I do see it done right, but occasionally I do see it done wrong. Now, for number 6, we've got not side-decking Kuriboh, and this is particularly in decks that play both Chaos Sorcerer and Metamorphosis. Now, when it comes to how I side-deck, I like to side cards that are very high impact, and Kuriboh does fit the bill in my opinion, and I'll explain why. Now, Kuriboh, while it is good against some more off-meta decks like Rescue Cat or Cyberstein, this is mostly against Reasoning Gate, which, as I am making this, Reasoning Gate is the most popular combo deck in GOAT format. Now, why do I like Kuriboh against Reasoning Gate? Now, it's not necessarily that I think Kuriboh is unbeatable, but it is extremely difficult for the Reasoning Gate player to play around. And Kuriboh is very similar to Threatening Roar, in principle at least, but it does have some huge differences. Now, in particular, the main issue with Threatening Roar is that it really only buys you 1 turn. Now, of course, Kuriboh does too, but if your opponent, for example, activates Giant Trinade and you chain Threatening Roar, they can just go, okay, I'll just wait to go off next turn. So if you don't really make something happen on your following turn after the Threatening Roar, you haven't really done anything that productive. On the other hand, if, for example, you have an empty board and Kuriboh in hand, your Reasoning Gate opponent is going to just feel free to go off. And, of course, if Kuriboh can't stop enough damage, you might still be dead anyways, but this is very rare. Normally stopping 3,000 from BLS or 2,800 from Dark Magician of Chaos is enough to at least survive the turn. And now your opponent's used all of their resources, so if you have some sort of follow-up like Tribe Infecting Virus or Thousand Eyes Restrict, or potentially even a Blackluster Soldier of your own, or a Snatch Steal, anything like that, you basically say, hey, I'm going to make you waste all your resources, and then you just dismantle their field, and it's pretty much a free win from there. The other awkward thing about Threatening Roar is what you do if your opponent activates Reasoning while you have Threatening Roar set, or Monster Gate for that matter, because they could get Jinzo off one of those cards. So if your opponent activates Monster Gate, you have Threatening Roar set, you go, well, if it's Jinzo, I might lose. So you chain the Threatening Roar to their Monster Gate, and then, now maybe they get something like a Sacred Crane, and they just draw a card and can pass turn. So the issue is that versus a competent opponent, Threatening Roar is a card that your opponent can easily play around, whereas Kuriboh, not so much. And the reason that I say that I like side decking it in decks that play Chaos Sorcerer, and Metamorphosis in particular, is obvious. It is a Dark for Chaos Sorcerer. It is a level 1 for Metamorphosis. Of course, using it as a meta target is not really the ideal use, but it is something that you can do nonetheless. And particularly in a Chaos deck that plays Thunder Dragon, the nice thing about Kuriboh is, hey, Thunder Dragon is this free light that you can put in your grave, and then Kuriboh becomes a free dark that you can put in your grave. And then you can, hopefully get your Chaos Sorcerer out and try to take control of the game. That is the role that you are supposed to be playing in that matchup. And, of course, if you are playing cards like Mystic Tomato or Sangan, your Sangan can search Kuriboh, so it kind of becomes this card that you can search that can stop damage. And, the key thing to realize in the control versus combo matchup is, as the control player, the main thing that you're trying to do is just not die. And Kuriboh is very good at that, and I feel that it is being slept on and is better at stopping you from dying than some of the cards that other people are playing instead, like Threatening Roar. For number 5, we've got Sidedecking Cipher Soldier, also known as Kinetic Soldier. And like some of these other tips that I've given, I think players have started to pick up on this, and I think Kinetic Soldier might be on its way out of most side decks, but it was quite popular as a side deck card even less than a month ago, so I want to talk about why that I feel this is a mistake. Kinetic Soldier, of course, as we would expect, is good against warriors. The problem is that the average warrior deck has quite a few outs to this guy, especially given how popular it was. It kind of demanded that the average warrior player be good at outing this card, and hence they have. So if you set your Cipher Soldier in face-down defense, they can simply search a Mystic Swordsman level 2 and attack it, which is not great. Well, what if you put your Cipher Soldier in attack then? Well, in that case, they could just summon Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer, which is a spellcaster, and attack over it. And of course, the attack goes through, even banish 2 cards from your grave, which is obviously not good. So, even against the standard warrior list, playing this card is somewhat a 50-50 as far as which position you put it in, which can be kind of tough. And additionally, sometimes it's even not a 50-50. Skilled Dark Magician, which most warrior decks are playing either 1 or 2 copies of, can actually kill your Cipher Soldier regardless of its battle position. So, on one hand, Cipher Soldier, yeah, it can be kind of a high-impact card, but it's also a high-risk card. And if you are a control player, I don't really think you're trying to go for big damage with a card like Kinetic Soldier. You're just trying to stop yourself from dying. Now, are there some decks that should side deck Kinetic Soldier? Yes, of course there are. For example, if you happen to be playing a deck with Giant Rat, Cipher Soldier is a great target for Giant Rat to search against warriors. But in particular, I really don't like this as a side deck card in a Chaos deck. And the reason why is, well, as you might expect, Cipher Soldier itself is not a light or a dark. So if you're side decking out your lights and darks for an Earth, to some extent you're kind of already helping your opponent win one of the key battles, which is summoning your Chaos Sorcerer. So it's not that I think that this card is terrible per se. It's simply that I think there are better cards against warriors, and the average warrior player is quite prepared to face off against a Cipher Soldier, which, as I said, is why this card has been going down in popularity as of late. Number 4 is a little more controversial, and that is not playing Sangan in Warriors. Now, I want to talk about a pattern that I've seen in GOAT format with some of the so-called staples of the format. And this pattern is that I think people have this mentality that if one of these very powerful cards is not nearly as good in their deck as it is in the average deck, that they should just not play it. So there might be a card like Sangan that, of course, is a 9 out of 10 in a deck like Thunder Dragon Chaos, and they go, well, it's only an 8 out of 10 in my deck, so I'm not going to play it. But then, meanwhile, they're playing a 7 out of 10 card like Skilled Dark Magician, which would normally be a 5 out of 10 in a different deck. And that logic, of course, doesn't really make sense, right? It's your card choices aren't about how good they are relative to how good they are in other decks. It's how good they are on an absolute basis. So, yes, Sangan is not as good of a card in Warriors as it is in Chaos. But there are still some pretty good targets. DD Warrior Lady, Exiled Force, Don's Lug, and Mystic Swordsman level 2 are all played in Warriors and are all very fine targets to search out. And Sangan, of course, it's a dark monster, which your typical Warrior deck is going to be playing at least a Blackluster Soldier, if not a Chaos Sorcerer, so it checks that box. In addition, Sangan does search side deck cards. Cliff the Trap Remover is a warrior monster that is commonly sided. Sangan searches that out too. Mystic Swordsman level 2. Warrior decks are often either maining or siding the second copy, which is another card that Sangan can get. So there's certainly no shortage of Sangan targets. Yeah, it doesn't search Sinister Serpent because you don't play that, but it searches a lot of great other cards. And something to understand about Sangan is actually one of the best aggressive monsters in the game in particular situations. Now, if your opponent has a set Dekochi, is Sangan good there? No. If your opponent has a set Dark Mimic, is Sangan good there? No, of course it's not. But if your opponent has a bunch of back rows, Sangan is amazing because it just keeps attacking for 1,000 and your opponent's not going to want to hit it with like a Sakuretsu armor. And of course, if they do, more power to you. So, especially in Warrior Mirrors where you just sort of go back and forth, trading hits, Sakuretsu armoring each other's guys, mirror forcing each other's guys, Sangan is great in those stalemates where you can break through and push for extra damage. So that's why I think Sangan should be highly considered in Warriors. Is it going to be the best monster in your deck? Probably not. Is it good enough to make the cut? Absolutely. All right, folks, we're moving on to our top 3 GOAT format deck building mistakes. And number 3 is kind of similar to number 4 in the general reasoning, and that is not playing Torrential Tribute, particularly in control decks. Obviously, in a combo deck like Empty Jar, you're not going to play Torrential Tribute. We all know that. In Reasoning Gate, you could play it, but usually you don't. But in a control deck, you definitely need to play Torrential Tribute. Now, on one hand, I can kind of get the logic behind why some people don't want to play this card, and that is if you're trying to protect something like a set Dekochi or a set Magician of Faith, Torrential Tribute isn't great at doing that in particular, because, of course, Torrential Tribute destroys your own monsters too. However, there are just such a large variety of situations where Torrential Tribute is a blowout that I think you're really giving up a lot of power and a lot of potential to gain card advantage by not playing this. And of course, we all know that control decks love card advantage and they love mass removal. It's interesting because you do see these warrior aggro decks playing Torrential Tribute, and that might be the kind of deck where you would assume maybe they wouldn't play it because they're trying to be more aggressive. But I actually do think Torrential Tribute is good in warriors, and I do think it's good in these flip effect heavy control decks like Flip Control or Thunder Dragon Chaos. And if the meta were all control mirrors, I could see maybe not playing it because it's not necessarily super good at a control mirror, but realize that Torrential Tribute is great against warrior decks, which see a ton of play, pretty good against some of the combo decks like Reasoning Gate, which see a lot of play, and between Torrential Tribute and Mirror Force, Torrential is the one that is often harder to play around, right? They can't go Breaker, to kill your Torrential. Sometimes they'll have locked themselves with a Thousand Eyes, and the only way to get out of it is to summon another monster, and you Torrential. Even if they are trying to sort of play around your Torrential, sometimes you can summon a Sangan or a Sinister Serpent and force through the activation of your Torrential. So, needless to say, guys, Torrential Tribute's a good card, so it really is worth remembering, guys. Just because a very powerful card like Torrential Tribute isn't 100% as good in your deck as it is in someone else's deck, doesn't mean that you just shouldn't play the card at all. For number 2, we've got playing Upstart Goblin in a non-combo deck. Now, I often see this played in various forms of control, like Thunder Dragon Chaos. On occasion, I've even seen it played in beatdown decks. The other day, I actually played against a zombie deck that was playing Upstart Goblin. And regardless of whether we're talking about control or aggro, what you have to realize is that life points are very fundamental in GOAT format. I think sometimes, particularly newer players, will get this impression that card advantage is the only thing that matters, and that's really not the case. In a sense, and I've talked about this before on occasion, life points in a way can kind of be its own card advantage in the sense that life points is a resource that can be converted into more options and more cards. So, as an easy example here, if you activate Upstart Goblin, and because of the fact that you did so, you give your opponent one more turn to live than they would have had otherwise, that's like you're giving your opponent an extra card that they wouldn't have had otherwise, which in a sense kind of makes Upstart Goblin a -1. Now, Upstart Goblin does have its advantages too, and it's not all bad. So the one thing that's nice as a control player to be playing Upstart Goblin, particularly in a deck like Thunder Dragon Chaos, where people will side in Trap Dust Shoot against you, is Upstart Goblin does make Trap Dust Shoot a little weaker, in the sense that if your opponent goes first, Dust Shoots your 6-card hand, and one of the cards is Upstart Goblin, really it's like they only Dust Shooted a 5-card hand, because obviously they can't send back Upstart Goblin, and you can convert that into another card. The other reason that people play Upstart Goblin, and I don't agree with this reason, but I will mention it, is that they can activate Upstart Goblin turn 1 and then set Magician of Faith, right? They'll have a spell in their grave for Magician of Faith. But that is a really suboptimal use of Magician of Faith, because you don't want to just be activating a bunch of Upstart Goblins, starting your opponent at 10,000 or 11,000 life points. Because, as I said, in GOAT format, life points are very important, and giving your opponent extra life points means giving them extra turns, which means giving them extra cards. And, if you start at 9,000 versus 8,000, that's not really much of a fundamental difference. But if you activated 2 Upstart Goblins and at some point in the game your opponent's at 5,000 when they would have been at 3,000, that's very different because it's much easier to deal 3,000 in a single turn as a control player than it is to deal 5,000. So you're putting your opponent under more pressure and making them play more defensively and play more carefully. The more life points that you have, the greedier you can be and the less careful you have to play. So as for me, I like restricting my opponent's options, putting them in a tough spot, which is why I do not play Upstart Goblin in something that is not a combo deck. The way that I think of it, activating Upstart Goblin will never win me a game, but it definitely can lose me the game. Alright guys, we're finally down to number 1. If you've followed my GOAT format content for a while, it shouldn't surprise you, Wing Blast versus Raigeki Break. Now, I could make a whole half-hour video about just this issue in particular, but I'm going to try to not get carried away. So, let's get into it. Most Thunder Dragon Chaos players are choosing to play Raigeki Break instead of Phoenix Wind Blast. Not all of them, but a pretty large majority. And I think this is a pretty huge mistake. Now, when I talk to most players who have actually tested both cards over a large sample, they will willingly admit, oh yeah, Wing Blast is definitely the better card the majority of the time. But when I talk to people who haven't tested Wing Blast, they will often cite very specific scenarios where Raigeki Break is better. And in some cases, they are correct. For example, against Snatch Steal, you'd rather have a Raigeki Break than a Wing Blast. But then they cite other cards like Breaker the Magical Warrior, to which I would say, no, against Breaker, I would actually rather have the Wing Blast. Since in your typical Thunder Dragon Chaos deck, all of your spells or chops are going to be chainable, other than maybe a Mirror Force, and you would actually just rather make them redraw their Breaker. And of course, there are a lot of Tier 2 decks where Wing Blast is just clearly the better card, such as Zombies, for example. You definitely want to Wing Blast their Vampire Lord to the top. You definitely want to Wing Blast their Pyramid Turtle to the top. Because if you Raigeki Break their Pyramid Turtle, they can just Book of Life it back and then banish the Sinister Serpent that you discarded, which is pretty rough. And additionally, there are even some top tier decks where Wing Blast is just clearly the better card. Reasoning Gate is a great example. If they special summon something like Sacred Crane off a Monster Gate, you want to just Wing Blast it to the top and force them to redraw their Crane. Reasoning Gate just has so many bricks that Wing Blast is just an amazing, amazing card against them. Additionally, I find that, sort of getting into the more general principles of the Chaos Mirror, I really want to be Wing Blasting their monsters instead of Raigeki Breaking their monsters, because these mirrors where people are siding in cards like Kaiku, which can banish cards in your grave, Dust Shoot, which can put monsters in your deck instead of in the grave, and Mind Control, which can be used on Chaos Sorcerer to banish itself. In those mirrors, the graveyard is such an important resource, and much in the same way that Dust Shoot sending a card back into the deck is better than discarding it, thus Wing Blast is better by putting their monster on top of the deck instead of discarding it. And there are a few tricks that you can do with it. For example, if you Wing Blast something to the top and cross out their flip effect, the deck will be shuffled and they won't redraw it. But also the reason why I like Wing Blast more is because there are just so many powerful top decks in GOAT format. And just sort of having that peace of mind of going, oh, I'm Wing Blasting their Blade Knight. I know they're going to draw that instead of a Pot of Greed. Oh, I Wing Blasted their set Dekochi. I know that they're going to draw some sort of set monster instead of a BLS. Getting into that mindset, being able to take advantage of the information that you have, being able to stop your opponent from lucking their way out of the game is extremely useful. So if your opponent, for example, say has 30 cards left in their deck and 3 of those cards are +1s, that's a 10% chance they're going to draw +1. So the top card of their deck is actually going to convert to 1.1 cards on average. Whereas, of course, if you Wing Blast something to the top, it means that they're not going to draw +1. They're just going to draw 1 card. Overall, information is king in GOAT format. I am a planner. I am not a reactionary. So I thrive on information and reads-based play. I want to dust shoot my opponent, Wing Blast the monster to the top, and then deal with perfect information for not only this turn, but also the next turn. I like doing something even like Wing Blasting a Chaos Sorcerer to the top of my opponent's deck, knowing that, hey, if I can get lights and darks out of their grave with something like my Kaiku, they now have a brick in their hand. Or I can just set a monster in my hand like Dekochi and know that, hey, Sorcerer is a good card, but it can't banish my set Dekochi. So, like I mentioned, I really think that this is a card that you should try. It does sometimes play a little differently than Raigeki Break. Wing Blast is kind of a more offensive card that stops your opponent from getting back in the game, whereas Raigeki Break is a more defensive card that's better at dealing with a card like Snatch Steal or Blackluster Soldier that is going to end the game all by itself. But overall, I think Phoenix Wind Blast is the better card on average, which is why you should give it a shot. So thanks for watching, guys. Do you think that there's an even bigger deck building mistake that I didn't talk about? If so, be sure to let me know in the comments. Until then, I'll see you next time.